Have you ever noticed those mysterious train tracks down around the waterfront of San Francisco? Well, this is little of what remains from a much more extensive network, once responsible for freight movements between the city's many docks and the land beyond. However, at times, these rails also served as a showcase area for special locomotives, such as the Freedom Train or the inauguration of the legendary California Zephyr. So, what caused the downfall of this once celebrated aspect of San Francisco? Stay tuned to find out, as today we cover the rise and fall of San Francisco's Lost Belt Railroad. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Towards the turn of the 19th century, the Embarcadero district of San Francisco was in full swing. European and Asian immigration was thriving, goods were moving en masse. In other words, the city was the most important international port on the West Coast. Naturally, to further facilitate the effectiveness of these operations, California elected to construct what was then called the State Belt Railroad in 1889. Public state ownership was preferential to private ownership, as it offered immunity from some federal regulations and oversight. With that in mind, the first iteration of the early network was a dual-gauged track set for the North Pacific Coast Railroad and the South Pacific Coast Railroad. These were both common carriers in the area, moving everything from local dairy to lumber, some of which was moved across the bay on barges. With the continued success came continued growth of the network, and by 1914, tracks were extended on a wooden trestle across the shallow stretch of the bay known as Black Point Cove. As the State Belt Railroad expanded to service the port of San Francisco, it eventually encompassed 68 miles of trackage, 12 steam locomotives, and later 6 diesel engines, with general offices in the ferry building. The rails ran out onto spurs covering piers, old and new alike. For the most part, it functioned as a switch network, moving railcars between the significant railroads of the area and the port. At least that was the case until 1913, when the network was expanded towards Fort Mason to accommodate the construction of the Panama Pacific International Exhibition, or the World's Fair. This development allowed massive amounts of construction material to be brought directly in from the port. Then, upon the outbreak of World War I, the railroad saw new use as a valuable network supporting West Coast military initiatives. For this reason, a further expansion was made in the form of a tunnel that brought the rails into Fort Manson Army Post directly. Then, by 1917, California further extended the tracks right into the Presidio Army Base. With this critical infrastructure in place by the time World War II broke out, troops and supplies could move comfortably along the tracks throughout the entire conflict. Army hospital ships would unload wounded soldiers onto ambulance trains, where medical personnel would escort the veterans back to the Letterman Army Hospital. In terms of how busy the port was during the war, let me offer you some numbers. The Army moved 156 troop trains and 265 hospital trains in 1945 alone. However, as the highlight reel was captured in the form of black and white wartime photographs, offering the perception that the Belt Railway was a hyper-utilized part of the city, the reality behind the scenes was slightly different. You see, towards mid-century, LA surpassed San Francisco as the dominant port on the West Coast. Hence, beyond some limited dry freight, the port of San Francisco was dying, and it was taking the Belt Railroad along with it on the way down. The downfall of San Francisco's Belt Railway happened astonishingly fast. The late 1940s had already witnessed a monumental shift with the rise of LA as a port, but once containerization took hold, the trains began standing in place. And then, as something of a death blow, the U.S. Army deactivated Fort Mason, and by 1966, there were practically zero train movements along San Francisco's fading waterfront tracks. And then, in 1968, with the completion of the new Letterman General Hospital, there was not even the prospect of returned military use. And so it was. In 1969, the state sold its almost century-long water rights to the city, and the railway was renamed the San Francisco Belt Railroad. Between the 1970s and the 1980s, the rusting network was in despair, hardly capable of moving trains even if the need would arise. Perhaps the only exception was down at Pier 96, a new facility near Hunters Point that actually relied on the Belt Railway somewhat. There were also some ceremonial uses of note, such as a visit from the Flying Scotsman, which had just concluded its American tour, the American Freedom Train, pulled by the ex-Southern Pacific Daylight, number 4449, and the Canadian Pacific Royal Hudson in 1977, as it made its way south to Los Angeles. Aside from these events, the trackage north of the ferry building was removed or inactive. By 1993, the railroad company had gone out of business and left things in a state of abandonment. So now, let's have a look at what remains. By the year 2000, almost the entire network along the Embarcadero had been paved over, with some trackage left in road medians for streetcars and light rail service. Well, these tracks are the little that remain from a once sprawling network. And at least one successor received permission to operate on them. The San Francisco Municipal Railway's Embarcadero line, which traveled between Caltrain, formerly Southern Pacific Station, and the Fisherman's Wharf, with other lines utilizing small portions of the abandoned route as well. Although the tracks have long since disappeared, the roundhouse was converted into a commercial center and is accessible to the public. All four of these state railroad flat cars have been preserved at the Golden Gate Railroad Museum and are considered an essential part of the exhibit's heritage. Additionally, steam engine number 4 is the only known survivor from the early period of the Belt Railroad. Brought in from the Vulcan Iron Works of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania in 1911, this locomotive played a key role in Northern and Central California before being hid away for over 30 years in the Stockton scrapyard. However, once train enthusiasts discovered this missing gem, it traded hands several times, was sent to Utah before finally being returned to San Francisco in 1988. In the modern day, if we were to tour the former lines, starting at the southernmost portion along King Street, we'd find Oracle Park now occupies that location. However, when the tracks were in place, they provided a crucial link to the Southern Pacific, whereas a train ferry slip at Pier 43 allowed interchange with the Northwestern Pacific, the Western Pacific, and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe railroads, the latter of which actually has its own song. Anyhow, in the north, the line passed through the Fisherman's Wharf, Aquatic Park, and the Fort Mason Tunnel to reach its northernmost terminus point. Some of you may recall this location from the 1971 movie Dirty Harry. Little has changed since then. The tunnel remains in disuse and abandonment, with restoration estimates predicted to be upwards of $60 million. And there's little use for it, so it will probably remain this way for the foreseeable future. That's the story of San Francisco's Lost Belt Railroad. But if you have more information on the topic, please share your knowledge with our community in the comments section below. And if you'd like to be a closer part of that community, please consider clicking subscribe or join. Otherwise, until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.